This conference will now be recorded.
Andy Smith, representing Mary Washington, the university.
Thank you. Ian Hollis, as you know, from FAMPO.
Tamara Banks, Healthy Generation.
Hank Sharpenberg, CTAC Chair.
Dave McLaughlin, CTAC, and representing City of Frederick.
Amy Garbarini, Northern Virginia Transit Planner for DRPT.
Welcome, Amy, to the meeting. Shall we go down Rupert?
Rupert Foley, CTAC member, Fredericksburg, Virginia.
Lee Anderson, CWI.
Paul Milday, I'm here for the Chamber of Commerce.
And we have also from King George County over there, a good friend. Introduce yourself.
Yeah, sure. Nick Miner, Director of Economic Development and Tourism, King George County.
Okay, and then our folks online, can you hear me?
I'm clear.
Great. And Matthew, can you just read off the list of names there for Jordan to capture as well?
Yeah, she's got
You've got them all? Yep. Will you just tell us who's there? This seems quite a long group this time.
Bailey Thompson, Clark Thomas, David McKinney, Linda Lassutte, Nick Ruiz, Michelle Shropshire, Daniel Zachary, Zach Daniel, and Zach Harris.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. Those are folks from largely our state partners that are online, and I just want to welcome you all as well. With that, we're going to kick off today, and if I can just give you an overview of where we are before we get into the documents and the discussion. Today, we're concluding the discussion of the overall study and the elements that we're going to be studying through the two phases. Then we're going to move to looking at documents that only relate to phase one. So those are going to be transit-based items and bike and ped items that relate to transit. So access to train stations and that kind of thing. We will not talk in phase one again about roadways after the first half of this meeting, because that goes into phase two. Phase two is dealing with all of the roadway upgrades and changes and amendments, right? So the first half of this meeting, we will still talk about all the modes, and then we'll go into a second part of the meeting where we'll switch over to only phase one. And from now until the end of phase one, we will only talk about transit, bike ped, and the roadway stuff. The consultant that we are soon to appoint will be dealing with the roadways which we specify, and we're going to discuss those today. So after today, we want a final list of these are the roadways we want you specifically to look at, and I will then work with the consultants to draw up their scope of work. We've already done some of it, and they will begin as soon in the new year as we can issue a notice to proceed by the policy committee. The policy committee has to approve all of our spending and for large items, and so the notice to proceed will be issued when the policy committee has made the approval. So that's where we are today, right? We're going to start off looking first at the general conditions, and then we're going to move into the phase one specific transit and bike ped items. Everybody clear? So we've sent you 3 documents in pre-reading. The first document is Technical Memo 2, which you've already seen, but we took some input from you all at our previous meeting, and some of the comments were that this memorandum was too focused on the whole region and every detail of the region and not focused enough on east-west mobility. So we have shortened the document. We've taken out some of the stuff that wasn't really relevant to east-west movements and the related background conditions. And we've inserted a couple of items that are specifically elaborating what's going on with the east-west movement of people and goods. So all we're doing here is bringing you back this document with the revisions that we made to say, we listened to what you said, we made amendments, and we hope that you're happy with it. We sent you the revised one out on the email, so if anybody has any questions or comments, now's your chance. Is everybody happy with the amendments we made and you're happy with this document? We'd like to put this one to bed. It's the basic conditions, talks about what's going on now. So nothing in there is what we'd like to do. This is just what's going on now. Everybody good?
One comment, it's an excellent reference manual, document, and all the members of CTAC, I think it gives them to have that, as a soft copy. That perspective.
The CTAC's very welcome to have it. I'll leave it up.
When you say it's finalized.
It's going to be finalized now, this document. So if you would like it, please let us know and we'll happily make it available to you at CTAC. But I think it sounds like there are no comments or criticisms or edits or changes that anybody's requesting. We're good to go with this one. Thank you. Then I think, Matthew, if we can start pulling up the slides. The next two documents are new. You won't have seen them before. And Matthew and I are going to run through them. So the first one, actually, I'll just sit here. I don't need to stand in the front. The first document is this Memo 3A, which is taking everything we've discussed in this meeting from the beginning until now about where the problems are. And we've created this document to look at study locations and the identified concerns. Now, the full-length document was in your pack that was emailed to you, and Matthew can pull it up if we need to refer to it. So this is just a summary on the slides, because, to go page by page through a document in a meeting like this is often tedious. So, Memo 3A, the locations, and we've tried to summarize this, and this document is going to be the basis for what we ask the consultant to do, right? In terms of phase 2. Sorry, I should clarify. There's phase 1 and phase 2. The phase 2 portion of this document will be what we ask the consultant to do. Next slide. So we're aiming to answer this question. What are the key regional east-west mobility needs in the FAMPO GWRC region under those modes, bike and ped concerns, transit concerns, and roadway concerns? Next slide. Bike and pedestrian needs were established through looking at catchment areas, input from the university, input from Germana Community College, input from the Fredericksburg Cyclists Club, and representatives of the FAMPO Bicycle and Pedestrian Advisory Committee, analysis of the Greenways study report, which has come out recently, and input from all of you. Next slide. We've divided the recommendations that we're proposing into phase 1 and phase 2. Phase 1, we're looking at connecting the VCR trail, the Bankside Trail, to the Fredericksburg train station with some form of lockup facility. We're looking at connecting the bike path to the Spotsylvania train station, including some other lockup facility, and connecting the bike path to the Stafford Brook station. That third one is quite a long shot. There is nothing available currently, but we've looked at some ideas and we at least want to have a proposal for the future. And remember, this study covers the period from now until the year 2050. So you won't necessarily build everything in the study next year, but we need to plan it so that when you need to build it in the future, it's properly designed. Phase 2, we're looking at, and this is a major project which we're proposing, connecting a multi-use path from the end of the Fall Hill and Cowan Boulevard multi-use paths through Central Park to the Spotsylvania Town Center and back. So we've got these two bike trails that go east-west from downtown Fredericksburg towards the Central Park area, but then they just kind of end. So we want to connect through Central Park and Spotsylvania Town Center to connect those paths. So if you get up there, you've actually got a safe way to cycle through those areas, right? The Route 3 pipeline study that VDOT is currently engaged with does have a proposal to connect across Route 3 for bike and ped, and it also has a proposal to try to connect from Route 3 down to the VCR trail. So we're not going to try to reinvent the wheel. I don't like wasting money on duplication, so we'll use whatever comes out of that pipeline study and try to connect the missing pieces. Then Stafford is currently involved with this US 17 bike and pedestrian study. We could make some funding available in this study to do any additional engineering if that's required on that east-west corridor. So we may not do any, we may do some, it depends on a request from Stafford and depends on the need. But we could do that in this study phase 2 with our consultant if necessary. Then there's engineering for small scale preparation for the phase 1 projects, which the consultant will do. And then we're going to look at connecting the new Chatham Bridge into the bike path, sidewalk, pedestrian system. Now, the bridge is brand new. It's got a great bridge across it. But if you're cycling, the connections aren't all there. In some cases, there are. There's a connection, I think, is it called the River Trail or the whatever it is on the south side? But we just would like to take a closer look at, for example, on this side, it's a Fire Street. If you want to cycle across the bridge, well, where do you go to when you get this side of the bridge, right? There's no direct bike path connection anywhere that's safe. We'd like to discuss in this meeting, when I'm finished with these slides, whether you all want to suggest any changes to this. We're happy to hear from you, but we want to nail down what we're actually going to do so that we can get on with the work. Next slide. Transit concerns. The transit needs were established through looking at transit-oriented populations. Certain groups of people are more likely to ride transit than others, so where are those? We map those. We used the FAMPO Transportation Improvement Survey material. We looked at input from the university, from Jemana College, and from the stakeholder group, etc. Next slide. Here are our proposed, when it says transit recommendations, that's not, that doesn't mean the recommendations that will come out of the study. That means the recommended areas we will study, the recommended areas we will look at. So there's a possibility that we could look at a BRT light, and I say BRT light because a full BRT is expensive and it has lots of technological requirements which we may not have available at the moment for us in this region, and we may struggle to get the funding if we go for a massive thing. But we're looking at a possible BRT light, which would work as a VRE feeder to the Fredericksburg station from areas west of I-95. We're looking at a fast, frequent, reliable connection on Route 3 from Central Park, Spotsylvania Town Center, UMW's William Street access, Fredericksburg train station, and possibly the B-Dot Park and Ride in Spotsylvania, right? The Park and Ride exists, so we could link that in. We want to then look at the 3 VRE feeders, which we think will be required for the trains to the Leland station, the Spotsylvania station, and the Brook station. We want to propose a downtown Stafford Transit Center with a feeder to the Brook station, links to Fredericksburg, OmniRide, etc. Some parking would be required. There is a transit center in Spotsylvania County at, is it Lee Hill or Lee's Hill?
So
It's a smallish center, but it functions to allow buses and other modes to connect. We think that if Stafford is going to build a new downtown, that perhaps you need a transit center there somewhere so that people can connect to get into the system, into the bus system. We would want to look at the possibility of an express bus from Stafford to Central Park and Spotsylvania Town Center. We heard this at the recent CTAC meeting, that people are concerned about a fast way to get to the shops from Stafford. And how do you do that? Well, perhaps a transit link could do that. And when we say an express bus, we're talking about a bus that has limited stops, that has slightly reduced headways, so it can take people to the shops and back, to the shops and back, to the shops and back during reasonable hours. And then we look at a review of the routes on Route 17 West, the transit routes, and along 208, and that's the S2 service. And then perhaps a redesign of S1 with additional connections to Cosmic Corner or Central Park. Those are proposals of what to study. Those are not the results, right? The results might be leave route S2 alone. It actually works fine. The results might say do implement a BRT, but don't implement an express service from Stafford. We don't know what the results are going to be. These are the things that we want to study in more detail to see whether they're feasible, to see what the cost is going to be, to see where exactly these things could be located. So you'll all be involved in that. Staff will be involved in that. And then the engineering is all going to be done externally by the consultant, not by us.
So just real quick, I mean, we're about to start a TSP process and we're going to be doing all of this stuff. I don't know if it's going to be, I mean, you say don't want to duplicate. These are things we're taking a look at. I think maybe to hone it down a little bit, stuff like the Stafford Transfer Center, things like that. If we're going to be doing a transfer center or some sort of park and ride, I mean, it's going to have a lot of parking. So if we're going to be having, if you want service to work from, you know, a suburban or maybe a suburban transfer center, what you really need to do is have parks people can get to the VRE. That sounds like it would be the main purpose. I think focusing on things like that for where we're going to put the transfer center, what kind of design. I know it could be in the area 1, area 2 plan. There's already plans for having some sort of transfer center in Central Park, things like that. With the VRE feeder stuff, what we're looking at is trying to incorporate the VRE stations on all of our routes where they run frequently, they run at a set time. I think, you know, having one station to feed to is probably the best idea for one park and ride, but then also incorporating all of the VRE feeders, all the VRE stations on our regular routes and things like that. And we're in our scope. I can send it to you. The scope of TSP. We're looking at doing a complete route redesign, and that's what the proposals are. That's going to be a year process. I would just hesitate at trying to get too in the weeds with this, and maybe put more of a 35,000 foot view on it, and then take that info and then put it into our TSP and work with the consultants there. I just think maybe we're getting a little too technical with some of this stuff that we need to focus with the TSP.
Okay. The point is that we do have some funds that will hopefully be available to do engineering work, but not now. It'll come in the phase 2. And we will liaise obviously with you and with your consultant during the TSP to make sure that we're not A, duplicating, and B, having contradictory outcomes, because that would be a disaster.
So and I think a lot of this stuff would be contradictory at this point. However, I think if you can maybe focus on trying to find a proposed east-west route for BRT from Spotsylvania Town Center. Exactly, and I know you have it on Route 3, but there's also other corridors to look at. Cowan Boulevard, Faughville Avenue's come up a lot of city staff because Faughville Avenue has more apartments around there and things like that, and it's also could be a quicker way to get through instead of having a massive construction project on Route 3. Maybe focusing on where to focus a BRT, and something that we have in the LRTP is a Route 3 and also Route 1 BRT study in the future. This could provide some good groundwork, and maybe, hey, you know, we looked at these corridors. Route 3 might not be good, or maybe it is good, and we focus in on that.
So the plan for that BRT light would be to examine multiple alternatives, right? You can't just go and say, hey, we want a BRT here, where you haven't considered alternatives. So something like a Cowan Boulevard or a Hall Hill Avenue or whatever would have to be one of the alternatives considered in terms of the alignment. So we would have to. You know, we can't proceed without considering multiple alternative alignments.
Exactly.
And we would look at those.
So I think the goal would be to, just reading from this slide, the goal would be to create a VRE feeder from downtown Fredericksburg, Spotsylvania Town Center, and then some of the areas in between. UMW Hospital. I think maybe setting that as a goal and then letting the consultant go for it would probably be fruitful instead of just maybe focusing on Route 3. Maybe I'm taking it wrong. But yeah, I think a lot of this stuff we're already going to be covering and having similar stakeholder groups like this. So maybe if we can get more recommendations. I know I spoke to you earlier about looking at points of interest in each of the counties in Fredericksburg, and then plot them out on the map and seeing how we can create routes based upon those points of interest. I think maybe if the East-West Mobility Study can give us more of a high-level look, so we can already have all this data to give consultants, because we're going to be having some of the top redesign and transit network people hold things like this and bring everybody in this room together and really create the system when we get to that point. So I just don't want to repeat work because whatever we get in that TSP is what we're going to go with. And it'll probably be a lot of the same stuff come out of here, but if some stuff comes out of the TSP with different information and having some more transit heads come together with it instead of looking at it from an East-West Mobility lens, I don't want there to be any friction either, any contradictory plans.
Are there items, I'll come to you in a second, are there items there is there one that you specifically think we should delete?
I think we should just put VRE feeder just by itself. I think we should do VRE service. I mean, all the VRE stations, I think, in my opinion, and this is just the way the TSP process is, it's not just me, right? But I think all of our routes need to be, all of our VRE stations need to be connected to our fixed route system.
Sure.
VRE feeder, however, you need to have big parking lot and you need to have direct service to get there. So having VRE feeders to more than one, I mean, maybe two is where you would want it, but having it to, you need to focus on what you're going to be doing, right? And I think that also focusing on the transfer center is good, but we have to understand that if our transfer center has the intention of feeding people into VRE, there needs to be parking. If the transfer center is walkable and it's just to get people into the system, is different. But for shuttle service to succeed, you have to have parking and you have to have other infrastructure in place to support that. You can't just have a transfer center and expect people to go. There has to be supporting facilities.
Correct. So if you look there, it says parking required under that item. So I think we're aware of that.
Yeah, well, when you said a little bit of parking, and so maybe it was just the way that I heard it, but there'd have to be, a substantial parking there for it to work.
Absolutely. I saw another hand.
Nick from VRE, mind if I just make a comment real quick?
Sure.
Hey, yeah, sorry I couldn't make it in person this morning, but one thing I'll say on that, I do tend to agree with whoever was making that comment. I think it's also important that we don't need to put this in the slide, but just keep in mind that anyone who's connecting to VRE, just keep in mind when you're studying what potential trips could be made in that way, that potential rider is already making several connections on the front end and the back end of their trip. And so if you're proposing, say, like a suburban collector park and ride that people will drive to, then they'll take a bus to the VRE, then they'll get on VRE. Well, that's a couple different transfers. And we know from experience that every time a customer is required to make a transfer, it reduces the potential ridership by a pretty significant amount. So just keep that in mind. But then the other thing I want to mention is also as a goal or a recommendation for phase one in terms of VRE feeder service, we see that as very essential to the future of VRE as we start to scale up from a morning in, evening out service to a more all-day service in the future. Make sure that the principles of those transit connections don't break down as we start to change our VRE service, because we're not, 20 years from now, 15 years from now, we're not going to be operating 8 trains up and 8 trains back. It'll be a much more variable all-day service, and so the frequencies of the connections need to be there in order to accommodate that increased level of VRE service. And then also consider Amtrak service too. At the Fredericksburg station, the state is planning 1 train an hour in each direction, so essentially a train every 30 minutes all day. So I would hate for those principles not to be baked into the assumptions that are made in phase one, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and just to add up that real quick, in the morning, with the struggle for us providing VRE services, when the amount of buses that we need to hit, I think it's right, it was the 8 or 12 buses in the 8 or 12 trains in the morning. There's a lot of manpower and a lot of money that has to be put in just to do feeder service. With VRE expanding, having, maybe a park and ride or some sort of feeder service is great, but having, constant connections all day, hour service, half hour service, to making sure that our network is completely covered. So if we have, right now we have 3 stations focused on there, right? If we have a route that hits all of them, in the morning, we could even put a tripper on it, make half hour service, and then still have the same route. And then in the daytime, go back to hour service or something like that. So I think having maybe one VRE feeder service is good, but for the commuters, but we got to connect it into the network, and that will bring consistent ridership to VRE, get cars off the road, and bring people consistently into the FRED system. So I would hesitate from using the VRE feeder language, but I would focus on VRE connectivity as much as possible.
Sure. Okay, so the point is, I don't think there's any disagreement. For Nick, we could have said VRE/Amtrak. I mean, it's the point is getting to the train station for people who want to travel. And saying VRE feeder doesn't necessarily mean it's a standalone thing that's totally separate from the network.
In this region, it does.
So it may be that an existing bus route is lengthened slightly to take it to the network, or it may be that we do need a separate service. We haven't made those decisions. This is just where the areas of concern are.
I agree with you 100%, but you're talking about twisting one around another one. We're looking at a possible complete network redesign.
Sure.
That would be different from that. So I think just identifying what this group would want out of it. I think, having consistent, reliable service to VRE, that would be a goal. What would look good for it? But as far as getting into the nitty gritty with the routes, that's already being done. Stuff like redesign, the S1, things like that. That's all going to be done with the TSP. So I think identifying what we need to do from a level, what the goals want to be, how that would work with east-west mobility, and then with all that stuff being us to take this from this group and bring it to the TSP, that will be a lot more helpful to us instead of already, trying to figure out what exact routes we want to do, where we want to go. But we need to figure out what the goals are, find out where the problem areas are, and then, we'll be able to take that into our TSP. And because we're doing a 13-month transit study, where probably 9 months of that's going to be looking at the route network.
Cool. You had your hand up, sir?
My only question was, what is the timeline? When is that study going to start?
Yeah, so we're giving a notice to proceed, hopefully January, maybe early February. Then we have a timeline for 13 months to completion.
Cool. Dave?
Sounds pretty clear that G, H, and I should come up. They sound duplicative of what you're going to be doing.
Yeah, I
duplicate those efforts.
Yeah, I think that when we say reviewing routes along Route 17 West, reviewing routes, I think we should say reviewing the corridors. Because the routes you see now in Fredericton at Fred, I think in 2.5 years, the route network is going to be completely different. You might not even have routes that are called the S1 anymore. They're going to be new. We're still going to be providing service to the same area, but our routes, as you know, are very they're not very good. They're not very direct, fast, and reliable, and that's what we're doing. So I think if we're looking at reviews of routes, we should look at reviews of corridors, and then we should also determine what our goals are going to be with the transfer center and with the VRE, providing VRE service 16 hours a day, peak time, half-hour service, things like that. And then once we get all that data, we'll be able to fit that into our TSP, and it'll bring more weight to the table that another stakeholder group and another study has shown these recommendations. I just think we need to pull it back a little bit, get more information together for the TSP, and then that'll be able to compound and make it even more of a powerful document. So a lot of this more specific stuff, I think, should be removed.
I've been out of the loop a little bit off and on. Can you explain, someone tell me where we are with VRE funding for the plan to run trains more frequently and against commuter traffic?
So you've got Nick online here, and I'm going to defer to Nick.
Yeah, thanks. Could you repeat the question? It was a little soft.
Yeah, this is Paul Milday. I'm asking you what the funding plan is to run more VRE trains, especially the off-peak hour, back and forth during the day trains, maybe a Saturday train. What's the plan to fund that? Did a bunch of money roll in the last few years? Because I haven't been paying attention closely.
Yeah, I wish, but unfortunately, right now we're still in the planning phase. So Transforming Rail in Virginia, which is the Commonwealth's program to increase service for Amtrak and BRE by allowing for a dedicated passenger track between Washington and Richmond. So those improvements that have to happen between 2026 and 2030, that has to happen first before we're essentially able to get more quote unquote slots to operate more service. I believe by 2030, if all of those physical improvements to the railroad infrastructure are done, that includes the long bridge across the Potomac, we'd be getting an additional, I think it's something like 6 slots on the Fredericksburg line for VRE service. But again, that's just a concept, and there's no actual funding attached to that. So that's something that our operations board, our VRE operations board, would have to approve. They have to approve the mix and the subsidy, by jurisdiction and everything. And we haven't even begun to broach that with them because we're still looking at a system plan update. We're still looking at how commuting patterns are changed as a result of COVID, and what is the most realistic type of service that we could provide in the 2026 and 2030 time horizons and then beyond. And so, unfortunately, we've got CARES money, we've got ARPA money that's kind of keeping us going today, but that's at the current level. So I wouldn't expect anything, groundbreaking until at least 2026 in terms of new service, if that makes sense.
It does, and that's the plan. That's what they had been doing with some successes of the minor improvements to allow for more slots and.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think you'll start to see more Amtrak service in the region, kind of rolling through before you start to see more VRE service and VRE service at different times of day, if that makes sense.
It does.
Okay, so to make good use of our time now, if you'll allow me to just finish this section, I think there's about 2 more slides, and then I'm going to go through the modes, bike ped, transit, and roadways, and make any deletions or additions that you all think we should make. Is that good? Because I want to get this done. I don't want to kind of sidetrack too much. So I'm going to leave this one. We'll come back to it now, and we'll delete 2 or 3 of those items which are not a good idea. We'll come back to them. Next slide. So roadway concerns, we looked at input from this group. We looked at data from the long-range transportation plan congestion modeling. You can see the map on the side there. And we looked at selecting corridors where there is severe congestion in the outer years. Remember, the long-range transportation plan has got a thing called a CLRP, which has a list of projects which this region has already decided they want to build. So, assuming those projects will be built, the consultant for the long-range transportation plan has modeled what the impact is going to be on the local roads. That model produces a map which shows you congestion, and some roads are still going to be severely congested even if we build all those projects. And the ones that are most severely congested are in red. Of those, we've selected the subset that are east-west mobility related, right? Next slide. These are the proposed corridors that are east-west movements, roughly, which we believe we need to study further because they're going to be bright red by 2050. They're going to be congested. And if you don't do anything about them, if we leave them alone, we'll fix the other roads that are already in the CLRP, but we're not going to fix these because they're going to be bright red. We've taken the input over the months from you all. We have looked at the congestion maps, and these are the ones which we think are important enough to study. There are some additional ones that are going to be red, but they're either very short roads or there is a low amount of traffic on those roads in total. These are more higher levels of traffic. They're more major roads, and they're going to be bright red by the time we get to 2050, even with all of the construction we're planning to do. So we are recommending that in phase 2, the consultant looks at a high-level analysis of additional access points to the I-95. Multiple ones have been suggested by the city and by Spotsylvania, etc. And then we look at this selection of roadway corridors that will, based on the current information we have, be highly congested over the study period between now and 2050. They will get increasingly congested and block up. So we will need to study those and find out why they're going to go red. Is it capacity all along the corridor, or is it certain intersections, or what is the problem? So there's first a high-level analysis, and then there's a dig in the weeds on these particular roadways. Matt, what's the next slide? Okay, no, that's done. All right, so those, if you look through that list of roads, we've excluded one or two, and the long report, which you've all got last week, explains why we've excluded a couple, and this is the list we've landed on. Now, what I'm going to do, unless anybody has questions, is I'm going to go back to the bike ped slide for you to add or subtract items on that list which you think we should. Then I'm going to go to the transit slide, and you can add or subtract items you think we should on that list. And then I'm going to come back to this one, and you can add or subtract. For the consultants, we need to rein in the number of corridors that we study, right? I don't want to go above 13 roadways. It just becomes too big and too expensive. The study will go on forever. So if you take one of these off, we can put another one on, but I don't want the total number of projects to increase too much over what we have here. Otherwise, the consultants will come look for another $100,000 than what we're already going to be paying. So I would like to not increase the total number, but we can swap out items where we think one's not necessary or another one is more necessary. Is that good with everyone? Unless you have questions. I'll take questions, but don't argue for a particular roadway yet. We'll get there in a minute. Any questions? Great, Matt, let's go back to the bike ped. All right, there's the list we're proposing. It's not a very big list, but there are one or two larger projects, like looking at Central Park and Spotsylvania Town Center and trying to connect those into the bike network. It will help students at UMW, for example, because instead of the bike park going some of the way there and then just stopping, we're going to try and connect the bike paths and connect them to the shopping areas or the cinemas or whatever the case is, so it becomes a complete network. Some of those other projects are smaller, and for Stafford, we don't yet know whether they're going to need us to do engineering on that, so it's an unknown quantity at this stage. They may not require anything because their consultant may be able to do that. Look at that list, tell me of something I should remove or something that I should add to make the bike and ped work that we do more useful. And remember, we're looking for major corridors. We're not looking for one little intersection where it's just a little intersection.
So part of the bike ped that gets frustrating is they always force bikes and pedestrians to follow the roads when that's not always necessary.
Yes.
And I've been told that's done because that's the only place where you can find funding to build a bike ped path.
And land.
Yeah. Well, no, the county will often own land that will directly connect from a subdivision or even multiple subdivisions to shopping and work and everything else in a half-mile bike ped path, but they force the bicyclists and pedestrians to go 3, 5, 7 miles around.
I understand.
Instead of going through. And I get all that and I understand, but since this is just recommendations, perhaps we could put that recommendation in, since we're not, I mean, at some point, it would be nice if that was recognized that following roads isn't always in the best interest of some of your other transportation demand management.
I think Matt is over there and I'm over here and we're hearing you, that we don't have to follow the roadways if there's land elsewhere available. I think that's a good idea. Is there a specific one that you think we should add, a specific place that we?
It's just overall for the region.
Okay.
And it would, I think it would help with the east-west because like I live in an area where there's, gosh, I don't even know how many subdivisions and whatnot that could be connected to all of South Point.
Okay.
Through a path that would be it'd be less than a mile long, maybe half a mile, but we can't. We have to go around, we have to go down Courthouse, or Levels Road, where it's 2-lane is not feasible
Okay.
and stuff. So, and it's too expensive to build the bike path along the road. But we can't build it through that little area that's owned by the county.
Matt?
So I'm wondering if one way to put this is subdivision connectivity or subdivision interconnectivity. Better connect the region subdivisions to each other as well as to activity centers throughout the region.
Okay, I was thinking more along the lines of studying direct paths in addition to adding them to.
Yeah, I just
Sorry.
I have to mention it because I know of it. There's a connection between the Brook VRE to the courthouse area through the Stafford Civil War Park. If you look at a map, you'll see that most of that is connected. You could do exactly what you're suggesting, which would keep you off of Andrew Chapel Road, which is a disaster.
Yeah, Matt has already come up with a couple of alignments on that in his mind,
Okay.
but we can't show you that yet. We first have to get you to agree to allow us to go and do it before we go and show you alternatives. Chuck, hang on, Chuck.
Go ahead.
No, go for it.
Remind me, Ian, particularly from a long-range perspective, why we don't have on the list a grade separation for BCR as Route 3 and or Route 1. I realize they're expensive, but it's the right thing to do in the long term, and they ought to be on the list. As someone else said, we're not going to get this all funded all at once, and there's a long-term kind of plan. And
so we can happily add those two. You're talking about either a bridge or a tunnel, right? And so we have had that as part of the current smart scale application. And so it was unclear when we put this together whether or not that's going to be done anyway, and it would be a waste of time to add it to this list. But if you're looking for actual engineering, we could add it to this list, just bearing in mind that it won't be ready for this round of smart scale. So we're happy to do it, and we can add it to that list now.
My sense is it's probably not going to be very successful smart scale effort at this point.
Okay. So Matt, if you'll just add those two bridges or tunnels to this, we will put it in for part of the engineering work that the consultant will do. It's engineering you need. You don't need alignment. You know where it is.
And if light construction, we get the money, we can take it out. But
that's fine. Okay, so Matt, we will add those two.
Trail over Route 3 and Route 1.
We'll add those two for you. Is there anything from any of our counties on? I'll come to you in a minute. On this list, things you think we should remove, things you think we should add. Now's your chance to scratch them or add them onto the list.
I can speak to Spotsylvania County. This is in just relation to the connecting the bike path to the Spotsylvania train station, including lockup facilities. I guess my question is that suggestive that Mills, because it's east-west, is the road that we're talking about here in terms of what that specific project will look like or where it's located? I will tell you from my own perspective, simply because with Smart Scale Round 4, we were able to secure construction of the East Coast Greenway with widening of Tidewater Trail from the city line to Shannon Airport. And now we're looking at getting down to Benchmark Road. I know it's along the roadside, but we're turning the corner on Benchmark Road. And Benchmark Road has some topography issues on one side. There's preserved lands in there. There's a railroad corridor running along the side of it. In my view, an engineering study to get the East Coast Greenway from Tidewater Trail to that VRE station would be tremendously helpful for us in terms of trying to pursue construction of that project. There's a lot of unknowns about that corridor other than an initial study. And I know Benchmark Road tends to be north-south, but it is consistent with implementation of the East Coast Greenway and in efforts to get to that VRE station and continue on. That would be my recommendation. I guess for clarity's sake, I'm just trying to understand what that connecting bike path to Spotsylvania Trainway Station, its extent would be.
Matt?
Yeah, so kind of one of the purposes of it was, as you mentioned, Mills Drive, US 17, connecting to Krasner's Corner, the hospital, all the new development, the apartments, and the density that's going up around there. So you connect that density to the train station. I know there's been talk of improvements along Mills Drive. So that could potentially be covered with that as well, whatever that ends up being.
Okay, so it is Mills Drive.
Yes, yeah, that was the intention. If there are other ideas, by all means.
The East Coast Greenway's coming through there.
Yeah.
We're working on it. So that would be my only other thing to say, and that's interstate.
So I think if we can capture these comments from Spotsylvania, Jordan, and then we can talk offline about exactly, this is just broad strokes at this stage. When we actually get into the study after this meeting for the next 2 or 3 months, we'll then liaise with you about what's good and not good from the county's perspective. Anything from, I'll come to you in a second, anything from Stafford?
I don't know if we necessarily need engineering studies for our 17 and bike ped study we've got underway, but maybe possibly just a review of that study to identify, the handful of best projects that would, facilitate and support the east-west connectivity.
I'm happy to remove it. We're not saying we must do it. We were just offering if the county needed some work. So we don't have to do that. We've got plenty to do in the study, but it'll be up to you.
Yeah, I say let's go ahead and remove it then for now. We can handle that.
Okay, so we're going to remove that one. That's fine. That helps. Then I've got you first and you second.
I would just have a question about the phase 1 versus phase 2.
Yes.
Which is, why are they
So
placed this way in particular?
So phase 1 is really meant to connect transit centers and transit facilities via bike ped or via other methods to get people to the train stations. Phase 2 is looking at all the regional bike ped infrastructure.
Right.
It's a slight artificial distinction, but we really try to link the bike ped in phase 1 to transit and the bike ped in phase 2 to everything else.
I agree with this. I do think that in terms of transit at the local level, if you're talking about students, for instance, going to Central Park, it's going to be key to have both the bike ped and the transit work together. I don't think those are two separate issues. So that's just something to note. I don't know if that means moving it to phase 1 or not, just something to emphasize.
Cool.
Sure. So the one suggestion I have is if you can sort of kill 2 birds with 1 stone, so to say, and continue the city's effort to create a bankside trail that goes the length of the Rappahannock River from kind of the end of the city limits to the end of the city limits, and also try to find a way to work the Canal Path Heritage Trail loop into the Chatham Bridge and the the VRE station there, kind of using, the city's looked at Sophia Street as being kind of its corridor there. Is there a way we could add that as a
The answer
study
to
item?
that is that I think, and we'll find this out in our phone call this week, I think that is going to be a substantial portion of the current smart scale round of funding applications, which means that VDOT will get involved in drawing the lines on the map. So I think that will be taken care of, at least I think, from the park through to the train station, through to the VCR trail, at least that portion. It might connect to the bridge or it might go under the bridge further on. The terminus is not yet determined, but I think that's going to come much sooner than this study. I think that that's going to be in the smart scale application.
Even better.
What I hear, we'll talk about that on the call. Anything else about bike and ped?
Just 2 quick things. I saw a lockup facilities for Spotsylvania train station. Any reason there's not lockup facilities for the Brook Road station either?
So the county, I was told when I first arrived at FAMPO, removed the plan to put lockup facilities at Brook and Leland stations. And, I don't want to start a fight with the county about the details in the study. I certainly would liaise with Alex and Brandon and other people about whether or not that gets actually built. I'm sure we will look at it as part of the study, but I didn't specifically mention that because I don't want to irritate the county that's already kind of spoken on the topic recently.
Understood. And just a quick second question. I know last meeting we discussed about possibly having a bike path on Cowan Boulevard. I see you have Fogel Avenue, Cowan Boulevard through Central Park, but were we still planning on possibly doing a road diet, Cowan Boulevard, connecting what would be possibly the new transit center in Central Park with the new area plan down to the current Fred Central transfer center and then down to UMW. Is that something that we were still looking at for bike ped?
So technically, and I'll defer to Matthew and the city, but technically there is a path on Cowan Boulevard. The two ends are the problem. It doesn't, when you get to your transit center, it kind of just dies there. And on the other end, it doesn't connect to anything in Central Park. So, I mean, I would focus this study on looking at those two ends. If you think that the current path is inadequate, then, I mean, we could put that on the table. But we did have a look at that, and there is technically a path there. I don't know what the city thinks of that.
Yes, there's facilities there. Could they be improved? Yes. And it does die off in Central Park, but it does continue on down to Route 1. So
I drove past there this week, and there is, I mean, there's a concrete broad pathway, but it doesn't have markings and signage, and it doesn't, when you get near the university, it kind of just dies, and when you get into Central Park, it kind of dies. So I think taking what's there and kind of finishing the job, I think, is what we should be doing.
I think that's a good idea, and it kind of leads me into the next slide a little bit.
Well, we'll get to the next slide now.
Excuse me. Bankside Trail.
Matthew, describe for him where Bankside Trail is.
So is that on the Stafford side? I'm sorry, that's would be on the city side. Okay.
Yeah.
Tamara, did you have a question?
I did have a question. I'm trying to keep up and understand. So is this just basically just for bike path, or are we talking
Yes.
sidewalks also?
So we're trying to focus on multi-use facilities. So it's pedestrians and bikes. We're trying to connect. What's happened in this region is that as projects have been developed, sidewalks have been added to roadway projects, and then they don't connect anywhere. So what I'm trying to do with this study is to tie up some of those loose ends so that you actually don't come to the end of the sidewalk and now there's nothing. You don't come to the end of the bike path and there's just nothing. We can't obviously look at every sidewalk in the city and every sidewalk in Stafford. The study will go on forever. So we just pick specific locations where we can do both bike and ped on a particular corridor and look at both on that particular corridor.
So it'll be bike paths and viable sidewalks.
Yeah.
Asphalt.
Yeah.
With a divider down the center. Bicycles on this side, pedestrians on this side, kind of thing.
So the consultant will have to then get into that level of detail. We're not going to do that in the phase one. We're going to give it to the consultant to say, here's where we want the sidewalk, here's where we want the bike path, fix it. And then they will design the engineering part of it.
Okay, so the consultant will ultimately have the final say on where the sidewalks go?
No, that ultimately the jurisdiction concerned, whether it's the city or whether it's Spotsylvania or Stafford, I mean, they have final say as to where you build a sidewalk in their jurisdiction. This is a study that's looking at the data and looking at what's there on the ground and planning for the future to say, this is what we propose should be done to link all these things up throughout the region. And then it's ultimately up to the jurisdiction to decide whether they want to proceed with that or not. They could decide they're not going to because they want to spend the money somewhere else, or that's a different priority for them, which is why we invite them to these meetings so that they can tell us straight up when they don't like it. So we don't waste our time. But it is up to the jurisdictions in all cases to decide whether or not to proceed with something. Even I'm sure Aidan will tell you, even the bus system, if the jurisdiction absolutely refuses, it's very hard for Fred to implement it, right? So the jurisdictions have to A, be involved, and B, make that decision to proceed or not. First, we're doing a study where we're making recommendations to them as to what they should do to fix the system. So that's what this is. All right, so we've taken off the engineering for US 17. Any other changes I need to move because we're running out of time?
I have to ask, whatever became of a discussion of pedestrians and bikes across 95 to 610, connecting Aquia Harbor to the most dense area in the region, which is, I believe, the 610 corridor. Does anyone ever discuss, we have a serious pedestrian problem crossing that highway? I know it's huge, but did anyone look at it?
The discussion has been around the existing bridge isn't sufficient enough to accommodate pedestrian traffic. Would either need to widen the existing bridge or provide a separate separate pedestrian bridge over 95 and just the costs for that.
I know, it's crazy. This is a study. I didn't know if you had come up already, if you just axed it because it was too expensive.
It is just, yeah, mainly just the cost of it.
So I think the county's aware of it, and for us to go put a line on the map and say do it would be, I think, just.
Thank you.
I think, okay. So I'm going to move on from this. If there's no more, we'll make those changes. For the transit one, this seems to be where most of the discussion is. Just give us tell us, I think we should remove, say, looking at the S1 route, for example, we'll remove it. We'll remove whatever one, and then we'll have a list of projects we can proceed with. If anybody wants to add one, please do that.
Yeah, I think we need to remove all the VRE feeder and change it to VRE connectivity. And
okay, that will change the language to say connectivity.
We got to get away from the feeder connectivity. Also, as far as reviewing routes, I would change it to reviewing corridors. I mean, the ones that I just shortlisted here: Cowan Boulevard, Fall Hill, Route 3, Courthouse Road, both of them, Warrenton Road, Garrisonville. I think if we review the corridors and figure out what kind of pedestrian improvements we need, connectivity improvements, things that can make it multimodal, that'll be due. But as far as
that's fine.
So the last three, I think we need to take out. I think the express bus is fine. Downtown Stafford is fine, but the BRT light, I would take out the routing on that. I would just say BRT from Fredericksburg Station to wherever you thought it would be, whether it's Spotsylvania Town Center. So put that in there. I would take out all the VRE connectivity, review corridors. I mean, those are 7 here that I think would be good. And then the express bus is fine, but looking at the transit center too. But yeah, VRE feeder and all the review of the routes got to go.
Okay, that's fine. I'll take the last 3 off. We'll add those 7 items that you just mentioned. We'll change VRE feeder to VRE / Amtrak connectivity, and we'll look at options for the BRT light in terms of the alignment. So that's fine. I'm happy to do those.
Thank you. And then I would also just take off the names of the stations because we want to go to all the stations. So just VRE stations.
Well, all 4 are there. So
yeah,
we'll look at all 4. Anything from the jurisdictions on transit that you want us to study? Done. Next slide. No, there. So these are the list of roads. As I said, if we can keep it to 13, I'm happy to take one out and put another one in. But this is data driven. If you looked at the report, it's tried to focus on, first of all, your input. Second of all, looking at the data, and then trying to synthesize those into a list of which are the major corridors that are going to be in red if we do nothing. More than what's already in the CLRP. That's the kind of principles that we try to apply. So I'm happy to hear if anybody has a view on this. Take any of your comments.
The technical memorandum where it lists them by area. For Fredericksburg, it says Fall Hill Avenue and Cowan Boulevard transit to Central Park. And that to me seemed like that should be in the transit section and not the motorway section, if that's all it's dealing with, or is it a greater study, a wider study that we need more study on Fall Hill Avenue and Cowan Boulevard?
Sounds like there might have been an error there. Matthew, do you have the
page 10?
These are roadways that came up in severe, so that's why we added them. They're also included.
Oh, I see. Yes. So there is the city has talked about a transit need along those corridors, but this section here deals with congestion on roadways, not transit. So this particular roadway recommendation list is not looking at transit at all. That is dealt with in the transit section, which is before.
So just in what's been published, or what draft that we're looking at, it says Fall Hill Avenue transit to Central Park. So maybe that just needs to be struck from. If it's roadways, or is it in the transit section?
It's in both. In the transit section, one of the recommendations is the Central Park. So, yeah, we can change the title.
We'll look at that page. Which page is it?
Page 10 under transit.
Okay.
Under roadway 1.3, it says City of Fredericksburg, Fall Hill Avenue, parentheses, transit to Central Park, Central Boulevard, transit to Central Park.
Okay.
Does that fit there, or does it fit there, or
We'll review
is
page,
something broader that we were interested in?
we'll review page 10. There might be an error there. Is this list, is everybody okay with the approach we took?
I just had a question on Kellogg Mill Road, just because I know that's really more of a north-south connector, really between two of our roadways with Poplar and Mountain View, and wonder for the east-west study if we shouldn't have like Enon Road on there instead.
So this specific one, if I remember correctly, was requested by your partner in crime, is online.
Okay.
To say, can we please add this one? So if you would like to change that and you want us to put Enon Road instead, we can do that. It was on our original list, but we screened it out when we were trying to come to the final list. So I don't know if you guys want to discuss between the two of you, but it was specifically asked that we add this 1 or 2 meetings ago.
All right, let me reconvene with Brandon and then I'll get back with you.
We can change that one if you tell us in the next couple of days. We can flip the one out for the other one.
Okay.
Hey, Ian?
Sort of from a broader perspective.
I'll come to you in a second.
Is this suggesting that more access points to 95 will somehow alleviate congestion on these congested or future congested roads? Is that
so?
What
Both the city and Spotsylvania would like to add an additional access point to the I-95. I'm not sure about Stafford. And part of the reason for that is that Route 3 is the only way you can get into some areas, right? Because there are not many access points onto the I-95. And so they're looking for different reasons at getting, for example, an access point near, is it Carby Silver, or is it the other one where that potential access?
The idea is to create a network of connectivity on 95, not just focusing on.
Yeah, and Spotsylvania is looking at, I think, Harrison.
Yeah, and I guess that was, I don't want to cut this. I was wondering about Harrison Road and what exactly screened that out specifically, because I know even in the memo, it did mention the possibility of a new interchange and our thoroughfare plan identified that. I was just checking on that.
So at a high level, we're looking at the Harrison Road possibility as an interchange. You'll see it in point 1.
Okay.
But when you look at Harrison Road on the 2050 map, very little of it is red. So the whole road we're not going to study,
okay,
but we're going to look at the interchange possibility.
Are they assuming our smart scale efforts out on Harrison Road that we build out? Because we are looking.
So the CLRP list, which you guys have already approved, was then put into the model, which gave out that result that it solves. The current project solves a lot of the problem, except for one small point.
Thank you.
Thanks. Any other comments?
Yeah, just almost a detail though. When we talk about Fall Hill, can we talk about Fall Hill / Bragg Road? I mean, to continue it all the way over to Route 3, and same thing with with Cowan / Central Park Boulevard to clear Marine all the way to Route 3.
I think Jordan's capturing that, so we'll do that.
You had Michelle online.
Michelle?
Yes, good morning. I just, following on the conversation they're talking about I-95, just for a minute, I had a question about what the anticipated outcome is from bullet number 1 about a high level, investigation there for additional access points on I-95. I know this has been looked at many times. I know there's been different ideas about additional access points on I-95 over the years. And that gets to be a very complex question very quick. So I didn't know what the outcome from this study was really hoping to be.
So the particular intersections have been studied before, to my knowledge, already by VDOT. We're not looking to redo the studies that already exist, but merely in terms of prioritizing projects for the future, we wanted the consultant to look at those studies and look at the needs by 2050 and give us some sense of urgency or priority in the final report of this study. So in other words, not redoing the study you've already done, but just bringing those threads together in terms of recommending a future plan for FAMPO.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
Great.
Hey, this is Stephen. It's funny, I just put a comment in the chat. Forgive my spelling, but very much around the same. In terms of just this study, I think it might be advisable to not consider additional access points to I-95 because there are so many challenges to that. Now, there are things you can do to make them more palatable, perhaps, like the provision of collector distributor roadway between an existing interchange and a new access point. But new access in and of itself is quite difficult, is frowned upon by the Federal Highway Administration. And I think it complicates our study here because if we suggest that, we need those types of things to make anything that was recommended by this study to function and work, then we might be really disappointed if those, huge types of improvements don't come about. So I don't know, that's just my thoughts.
I understand that, Stephen. The alternative is we build another bridge over the river, which I know nobody wants on certain sides of this equation. So at the end of the day, I know both the city and Spotsylvania are recently revisiting this issue and are, unless I'm much mistaken, and they're here in the room, both want to proceed with an additional access point to the I-95. It's not my particular viewpoint, it's just that we can ignore this and they can fight with you individually as jurisdictions, or we can take an overview of what's already been done and put it in the final report as we don't think anything should be done, or we think that one should be done, or we think that both should be done over the next 100 years, or I don't know what the final solution is. If you feel strongly we should remove it and the jurisdictions agree we should remove it, I'll happily remove it.
Right,
I don't have a personal axe to grind, but I know that both jurisdictions are reviewing this right now.
Okay, here's an alternative suggestion then. If we're speaking of those two specific locations, the one in the city would actually have access to a collector distributor system, which may make it much more feasible. The one that you're discussing in Spotsylvania could very well be connected to the CD road system that's currently under construction as well. So if it's those two, and those are and that's what we're really talking about here, then those two, I would not necessarily call those, again, it's semantics. Is this are we creating a new access point, or are we providing additional access through the provision of a CD system or something? So anyway, now that you've clarified that it's those two locations, I do understand that, that might be certainly worth mentioning here, but we should also, make any assumptions that are necessary to look at the alternatives, including connection to CD system, for example, that could make it more palatable in the future.
I would happily change the language, and I will happily specify those two locations if that'll make it easier.
I think so, because otherwise, for example, what if you were looking at Stafford County, not that they have any desire to see an additional interchange, but suppose that came up, you'd have a whole lot of other complicating issues like the express lanes and access to them and agreements we have with them and all those sorts of things. So many things could come into it. Or if we're looking at an additional interchange, say south of the 126 and it didn't connect, those types of things, you'd have a whole lot more challenges, I think, other than just cost. Of course, all of them are going to have a challenge when it comes to cost.
I understand. I'm happy to put those details into the specific request.
Thank you.
But Stephen, by the same point, we recently did a study comparing Gordon Shelton Boulevard and Harrison Road and cost benefits and the traffic mitigation, all that other issue with stoplight thing and all kinds of things. Would this be totally redundant?
You mean to consider it at all? That's up to you guys in the study committee. And
like you can refer to that study or something. It's already been done.
Well, let's talk to the city in Spotsylvania. I mean, do you want us to have?
I think what's changed is the nature of the collector distributor road. I mean, all those studies, I recollect, could be wrong, I think predate the actual construction of the CD roads, and that's the game changer, at least for the.
That's a good answer. Thank
for
you.
the city's section.
All right, cool.
Okay. Well, we'll define it very carefully and very narrowly, and it's a high level, just putting it back on the table that these are two projects that the jurisdictions would like. We're not going to do a complete study of them, but just to mention them as to whether or not they should be prioritized and at what point kind of thing. Good? All right. Now let's move on, please. The last report which you have is the start of the actual work. So now we're shifting gears from the whole study and looking specifically at phase 1, which is transit and related bike and ped connections. And we've started the work on that, the analysis on this. And Matthew, if you could run us through these slides quickly, please.
I will do that. So Memo 3B, as Ian mentioned, is getting into the actual work, the transit demand methodology and forecast. So really what we're looking to do is analysis of our transit markets. So for our transit providers, where are their markets for people who use their services? So we did a couple ways of looking at that. Data from the FAMPO travel demand model was used for the 2020 year, and then we have an intermediate year of 2035 and a 2050 forecast year. So like everything else we've been doing, we're looking at now through 2050. And then basically creating a travel market for each of our transit providers, VRE, park and ride lots, OmniRide, Fred Transit, as well as looking at bicycle demand. And those are done through a variety of data sources. But I'm just going to do a high-level overview of kind of that stuff here. So just the travel demand model, looking at the number of trips that are expected to increase for each of our modes, so Fred, VRE, and commuter bus. So for 2035, for instance, Fred, we're expecting from the model, 42% increase in trips. 2050, 74%. You get similar numbers of VRE, and commuter bus, you also get an increase as well. So we're looking at that here as, hey, this is how much demand could increase based on the FAMPO travel demand model through 2050. And then for each of those providers and their locations, so for each train station, for each park and ride lot, we're saying what are the catchment areas? Where are the people who use those places located? So an analysis of the catchment areas, and then looking at the population and employment for each catchment area. I mean, these were done just using several data types. So for VRE, for instance, using data on where VRE riders are located and pinpointing their first and second choice for stations, using data from a big data company called Streetlight Data for park and ride lots, for OmniRide to decide where the riders who are using the park and ride lots located, and so on. And then just mapping that and analyzing it in terms of population and employment for how many people within this area will there be now versus 2035 versus 2050, and what is the actual density around the station. So there's a big difference in density around Leland Road or Spotsylvania versus Fredericksburg Station, for instance. And then for Fred Transit, similar, identifying a catchment area around the bus stops, so the half mile and the 1 mile buffers, and then just the total population employment. And again, when we're looking at our commuter buses, our VRE, our Fred, pairing this data, the catchment areas, with our data from the FAMPO travel demand model.
Just before you go off of this one, just a comment from me. This is based on the existing Fred transit routes, right? So this is the catchment area currently based on the current routes. You saw in the previous slide that the ridership of Fred is expected, or the demand for ridership of Fred is expected to increase between now and 2050 by substantial amounts. Again, those are often tied to routes. So if you change the routes, the demand will change. If you change the route, the catchment area will change. So just bear in mind with this particular map, it's the current catchment area of the current routes.
I'm curious as to how the models are coping with the fundamental societal change on commuting and, for example, VRE ridership, which is 10% or less of what it was. How does the model account for growth based on that? Will it grow at the same rate? Because it seems the funding will follow the use. The use is dropped to almost nothing. How is the model actually accurately capturing that? Or
so,
what are they using?
So a couple of comments. The model is based on population growth and employment growth and land use changes. However, the model currently ignores COVID.
I don't think you can,
So
because it's leading to societal changes and employment characteristics.
I understand that, but there is no, because COVID is so recent a phenomenon, there is no current travel demand model available in the world that is yet able to predict based
I understand, but what
on the
you're
crisis.
telling me is the model is perhaps based on erroneous assumptions, that everything will go back to normal, or it is based on pre-COVID ridership levels.
Yeah, I don't want to get into a big philosophical debate because this is a very broad question where we don't have a lot of answers that we can nail down right now. The one thing I would say is that every major world pandemic has resulted in almost every form of transportation going back to what it was before the pandemic eventually. So in other words, there's a hiatus, and the hiatus might be 20 years. But the tendency over time is that people still want to get to the urban areas where they wanted to get to before the pandemic, and they eventually, over time, migrate back to those current places, which means they currently have to get there, which means they currently have to move. What we do know from the pandemic is that the traffic has rebounded significantly in Virginia, that the freight traffic is between 7 and 11% higher on all roads than it was before the pandemic, and that the car traffic is only slightly below what it was before the pandemic. So it's already rebounded in terms of road-based traffic to what it was. And the two things that drive transit, the two big things that drive transit ridership are cost and congestion. When the roads get congested and the price of gasoline or parking go up, people migrate to transit. Now that's delayed in this case because of fears of getting infected when you sit in a vehicle with other people. So there's a delay. But once I-95 is gridlocked again, there'll be a shift back to transit, which has already started. Fred is about 60% of what they were pre-pandemic levels. VRE is much lower, but
I think those are two separate issues, Fred versus VRE.
Yes, trains are rebounding much slower across the United States. Part of the reason for that is people who ride trains usually have another viable option. People who ride buses, less so. Essential service workers tend to use the bus around the country. So the bus ridership will rebound quicker because the people that ride trains usually have another option. But I promise you, when we get back to higher than pre-pandemic levels on the highways, VRE ridership will tick up, especially if the gasoline price goes up.
And Ian, if I could just add one more thing to that, that's all 100% true with respect to VRE. Just remind everyone that VRE ridership is very much beholden to what the federal government chooses to do in terms of their, personnel policies. We have a very high percentage of our ridership that are federal riders. They receive the federal transit benefit. And if the federal government says, don't worry, you don't have to come to work but 2 days a week or 1 day a week or at all, then I think our ridership is going to, at least in the peak period, peak direction, is going to reflect that, for as long as that remains a condition. To the extent that VRE starts to pick up new ridership, new markets that we didn't serve previously, then I think you're going to start to see patterns align more closely with that of a local or a regional, transit agency, bus and BRT and that. So just wanted to keep that in mind, everyone to keep that in mind, when you're talking about VRE, because yes, our ridership is about 10 to 15% of what it was pre-COVID at this point, and it's staying pretty consistently at that level for the past couple of months.
So when federal government policy changes, you expect your ridership to rebound?
Well, I think that if the federal government says, you all got to come back to work 5 days a week, then yes, I think because the fundamental issues that drove people to VRE in the first place are persistent. That meaning, high cost of parking in the core, congestion on 95, limited options, that kind of thing. But I think there's a lot of uncertainty, and so I think any study is going to have to include what the federal government. I mean, it's kind of crazy to think that this region is so impacted by just some policies that are set by OPM at the in DC, but it really is going to make an impact on, or have an impact on what happens with our service, with our ridership. So yeah.
Thanks, Nick. Matt.
All right, and the other thing we looked at was bicycle demand. So utilizing an existing methodology from the FAMPO Active Transportation Plan, and it just helps to determine where there is an increased likelihood for bicycle demand. So data included U.S. Census, streetlight data, school locations, tread stops, URE stops, etc. And kind of the map here is just showing where we think there might be a higher percentage of people who use bikes for this increased bicycle demand. So it kind of comes out with what you would expect, the higher amount of bicycle demand in and around the city of Fredericksburg, the more urban areas, as well as up in North Stafford. So summary, these travel markets show that the east-west corridors that we mentioned, many of those we mentioned, provide the links for all of our transit providers. When you go through the study document, you can see all of the catchment areas, as well as on the last page, our conclusion discusses all of those corridors, the major corridors that we were just talking about for the past hour. And again, the future demand is expected to increase, and this will increase the demand for future transit as well. There's going to be more travel along the corridors. And then kind of the last part, just to make clear, is there is these describe existing demand for transit services, and then the growth will increase future mobility needs, and there'll be a need for new infrastructure, meaning new demand, as we've been talking about.
All right, so folks, this paper that you have in your pack 3B is the first steps towards looking at where new service is required, where new bike paths are required, where new transit is required, or where adjustments to existing transit might be required or might be necessary, including TDM, park and ride lots, and all that kind of thing. So we've mapped out where people who use these modes of transportation live and where they're likely, or where they currently travel from to use a particular service, whether it's a train or a bus or a bike. We've mapped those in this document. We'll take any questions on the second document, just to let you know that the next steps are then to take that data and to start looking at where the existing facilities are, right, to compare those to where people need them to be. So that's what the next phase would be after today.
Just going back to the transit catchment, I suggest we make some small adjustments to it. So I think the first catchment area should be a quarter mile. 400 meters is the industry standard of how far people will walk for a bus stop. And I think we need to take down the mile area catchment to 3/4 of a mile. That's as far as we go with our deviated fixed route. So you could even put, if you wanted to, even do quarter mile, half mile, and 3/4, but probably just quarter mile and 3/4 will be a sufficient catchment area.
We'll happily change that. Bear in mind, this is existing. This is not the future. This is what we have now. We expect that to change because we're going to propose some changes. Fred's going to do this massive TSP, which is going to propose some changes. So where the riders come from in the future is not going to be this map. But if you look at the maps in that study about where transit-oriented populations are, that's more likely where the future ridership is going to come from.
And just for your knowledge in the groups, the quarter mile and the 3/4 mile area is what we're going to be using for our data. So it'll be good to standardize it.
We'll adjust our map accordingly. Any other questions on this last report? The fun part for us as planners actually starts now, because what we'd like to now do is look at this data and say, so where are the gaps in the current system relative to where people want the system to give them a bike path or give them access to the VRE train station, whatever the case is, and we can start working on actual planning. So we take a deep breath now. Thank you for your input. I'm happy to take any additional questions, but thank you really for your input. I think we know of the local jurisdictions, the local transit operators, and of some of our key economic development stakeholders, our universities, our colleges, and we can now say, how do we solve the problems for those folks? And Matthew and I are going to start work on that after today. Any questions or comments on that last report? Great. Well, thank you all very much. Thanks for coming, and have a good Christmas or a good holiday or a happy Hanukkah or a whatever it is that you celebrate over today, yesterday. I think Hanukkah ended yesterday.
Sunday night, yep.
So have a good holiday, all of you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everybody online.
Yeah, Ian, my dad tried to put up Hanukkah lights for our